So I'm Khandker from the Department of Physics here at Kent State. Welcome to the 2016 annual conference. Though we had start already yesterday, a couple of talks and a reception. Sorry about the early morning schedule, but I'm very pleased that a lot of you tried to be here and are here. We'll have welcome remarks by our Arts and Sciences Dean, Jim Blank, followed by comments by our Physics Chair, Jim Gleeson, and then an introduction or a survey of ICAM by one of the ICAM core directors, Piers. Piers is doing it. So I just wanted to say one word about our Dean. From the time I suggested that Kent State join ICAM way back in 2003, Jim Blank, then Director of Biomedical Sciences, since then he's been a strong supporter of ICAM, and then through the years, while he was Chair of Biological Sciences and then as the Dean of Arts and Sciences, he's always supported our ICAM activities and Kent State's participation in ICAM. You have likely noted his welcome remarks in the program booklet, and now I'm happy to introduce our Dean of Arts and Sciences, Jim Blank. Jim, thanks for making time in your busy schedule.
Thank you for all being here. It's the last day actually of our semester. Great you do at midnight, I think, tonight. So things are rapidly calming down. If you've not been in Northeast Ohio before, and if you came in on Sunday, you've been treated to sleet. Yesterday was sunshine, 60 days, typical Northeast Ohio weather. Tomorrow sunshine. So this is pretty normal for us. So you're going to see it all. But thank you very much for coming in. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the annual ICAM conference, this year hosted by Kent. Khandker was right. He came to me in 2003. That's a long time ago. I was director of the School of Biomedical Sciences, and I didn't know about this organization. He told me about it, and thought it would be of great use to certainly physics and chemistry, but also biology. And over the years, he's actually been right on target. We've been an active participant in ICAM ever since, and I'm really happy we were able to talk to each other all those years ago now. ICAM has benefited our faculty quite a bit, especially our students. I'm looking at several here who have benefited directly from our participation and taken advantage of the many benefits that ICAM provides with fellowships, workshops, meetings like this. This was a great opportunity for us to showcase Kent State and our participation in ICAM, supporting travel. All these things have been really important for our faculty, students in physics and LCI, biology, and chemistry. So I'm very thankful that we've had this opportunity to participate in ICAM. It's been great for our campus. If you're new to Kent, this building wasn't here 4 years ago, I think. In fact, about 1/3 of the downtown's been changed quite a bit in a short time period. The previous president decided to finally develop a town-gown physical connection. And if you look out the windows here during breaks, you can see the large new architecture building, the esplanade, arch between Kent and the downtown area. And it's really changed dramatically the university in ways that were always talked about for so many years that really never happened. The downtown itself is completely different. The only thing I really miss is the old wooden floor hardware store, but most of the other things are glad they're gone. The bar that was about 6 feet, had a ceiling of about 6 feet, which changed name every other month, is gone, for example. So it's truly brand new. We've got great music venues, lots of food, great shops. I've run singing tonight. I just saw in Kent State, which is about a 100-year-old movie theater, which has been kind of renovated, so it still has character to it. But take advantage of it if you can. It's a great opportunity to see Kent State and how it's changed the downtown and vice versa. I would say Kent's also grown a lot. The university, we're now we're now the second largest university in Ohio. Ohio State's always going to be the first largest university, but we have over 40,000 students now on 7 campuses, so we've grown dramatically in this time period. Finally, I'd like to especially thank Khandker for serving as the ICAM coordinator, asking for virtually nothing in all these years, not that you should now, by the way. None of this would have happened at all without his work, his hard work, his participation, and the other faculty and students to participate as well. So I'm really really pleased to welcome you all to this conference. Especially pleased to note that I plan to make ICAM part of the college, not just as long as I'm dean, but it's already been for a long time and become part of our fabric. And I would like to indicate it's my full intention to make sure that we continue to support ICAM. So thank you very much for coming. Please enjoy your days. Enjoy camp. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I guess next is Jim Gleeson, our physics chair, who's also been a supporter of ICAM through the years, and since he's been chair at least. And so I'm happy that he's going to make a few remarks. Thanks.
Thanks, Khandker. You can tell I'm an optimist wearing shirt sleeves in Ohio in May. It could be a hurricane later, it could be a blizzard. You don't know. I've gone to many conferences over the years, and I remember the words of every opening speaker that welcomed me to every conference I ever went. So I know everyone here is really soaking this in. As you heard, Kent State joined ICAM in 2003. I think that was just 1 year after ICAM was founded, if I'm correct. And as the dean said, it's been very advantageous for the physics department and the other science departments at Kent State as well. It's enabled our students, primarily our young researchers, our postdocs, to get opportunities to network, to meet people, to learn things that they just would not have learned in any other way. So that, for us, has been by far the most important impact of ICAM. It's, you know, our students, they come to me, oh, I want to go to this conference. Well, why do you want to go to that conference? Well, I get some money from ICAM. Oh, that's a great conference for you to go to. And then they go and they network. They sometimes make people that they're going to ask for, they meet people they're going to ask for jobs later, and it really helps them to launch their careers. So for us, it's been a tremendous advantage to be part of ICAM for 13 years now, something like that. So as the dean said, we look forward to this being very much a continuing relationship. The other advantage that I've seen personally for ICAM is that it's been a real help to many of our research programs. The focus areas of ICAM are really in the wheelhouse of many of the research areas in the physics department here at Kent State, both in soft condensed matter and hard condensed matter, quantum condensed matter, biophysics, all of those things. You know, sometimes when we do a lot of research, and sometimes I think of research as a little bit like gardening. You plant these seeds, you tend them, you nurture them, and some of them grow up into fantastic things, and some of them turn out to be weeds, and you have to pull them. Some of them don't do anything. In many ways, ICAM has been like a real great fertilizer for our garden. Now, don't take that the wrong way. But it's really helped many of these initiatives grow into something that they just would not have been otherwise. It's probably not enough by itself to start a great or to maintain a great research program, but it's particularly helpful in nurturing it, in giving it that extra boost, in allowing it to do something that it might not otherwise. So I'm really glad that this conference is here today, and I think, was it last year, I think, when Khandker was, I don't know where the conference was last year. Argonne. And I remember Khandker telling me about this great conference, and me and the dean said, well, why don't we have it at Kent State? And we had to twist Khandker's arm a little bit, but not too much. And here we are. And I think this is the first time the conference has been here at Kent State. So we're really happy that everyone's here. And I'm looking forward to a great day of talks and posters. And hopefully our students here today will get even one more opportunity to meet and network and get to know the people that they really need to know to begin their research careers. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So Piers, our co-director, Piers Coleman, is going to tell us about ICAM. And Piers, here it is. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm British, so I'm used to this kind of weather. So it cheers me up. It's great to be back at Kent. I want to begin by thanking all the people who made this workshop possible, particularly our staff, Cecile and Denise Merrick. thank all of you who've come from the corners of the earth to our ICAM meeting, from far away, from China, from South America, from Europe. We welcome you here. And also like to thank my co-director, Daniel, who was a major part in putting together this program. So let me just tell you, spend 10 minutes telling you a bit about the ICAM network, the ICAM-I2CAM network. Our mission is something called emergence. And emergence is the idea that complements the age-old notion of reductionism. Reductionism is the idea that if you can take matter apart to its smallest components, then you'll understand the laws that make things tick at the smallest scale, and then you'll know everything. But reductionism is the notion that, well, knowing everything at the smallest scale is not enough, and that as things come together, you get snowflakes, you get superconductors, you get and so on. And so part of our quest is to discover, using experiment, the organizing principles of emergence in matter. And emergent phenomena, they owe their existence to collective interaction. But emergence by itself usually can't be deduced from the detailed knowledge of those subunits. Even if you know the rules, even if you created the rules, you can't always predict what their consequences will be. And so everything from pressure, superconductivity, crystal growth, Conway's game of life. I don't know if any of you know about Conway's game of life. It's a very simple program which defines the way little squares interact with one another, but on the emergent scale you see structures like some that resemble birds and particles, and it's quite a nice example of flocking birds, fish, protein folding, even ourselves. And if you look at the program for today's events, you'll see this picture from a well-known sculpture of a thinker. And one of the questions it raises is how can a collection of molecules think about a collection of molecules? And it's very thought-provoking. So ICAM's main science thrusts are in 4 different areas. We've got soft matter, which lies just in the middle. We're interested in novel materials for energy, photovoltaics, energy storage, quantum matter, matter on the smaller scales, high temperature, superconductors, heavy electron superconductors, novel stark forms of order, cold atom systems, and last but not least, biological matter, from proteins to neuronal matter. All of these things interest ICAM, and one of the marvelous things about it is that we get to share our interests across this broad frontier. We're a network. One of my great heroes, Michael Faraday, was involved in forming one of the first institutes built in brick and mortar, the Royal Institute, and this was instrumental in founding 19th century physics in Britain and setting the stage for the discovery of electromagnetism, which would power the 20th century. Well, ICAM is a 21st century institution. It's not built in bricks and mortar, it's built from institutions across the world. It's linked by modern means of communication, and these are some of our various nodes across the world. We have about 65 nodes. And one of the questions you might ask is, why do we need an emergent network? And it's because many of the key problems that affect our world today, such as novel photovoltaics, high temperature superconductors, protein aggregation, advanced photonic materials, they're really too big for one discipline, institution, or country to handle by itself. And ICAM is an emergent network, not just because it's interested in emergence, but because the participants dictate and decide the science directions, and each year, and this year is no exception, brings fresh ideas. Where we do things is that we're driven by discussion-oriented workshops, cutting-edge schools, such as the school we're holding later this year in Rutgers in France, and research exchange, and we really spend our time focusing on junior scientists and trying to enable the exchange of scientists between our various nodes. time to ICAM's 20th anniversary, in fact. It was founded at a founding meeting in 1998, and its branch structure established in 2002, 1 year before Ken joined. We're about 60 branches worldwide. This number goes up and down. Sometimes it hits 70, sometimes it goes down to 55, hopefully not much below that. We have 13 nodes in Asia, 8 nodes which are actually, most of them are consortia of European institutions across Europe. 1 Middle Eastern node, although it's in Israel, so some people call that Europe. An Australian node, 31 in North America and 2 in South America. And amongst our Asian branches, we are currently trying to expand greatly the Indian network. Our current income, last assessment, is about $700,000 a year to support activities. We're just starting this year more Foundation ICAM-EPIC Scientists Exchange, which will run for 3 years. We run about 15 to 20 innovative workshops each year in biosoft, quantum, and energy. We are very active in communicating our frontier, and we've supported over the years a lot of outreach, both live and online. And we run various schools in emergent matter. We run them regularly in Europe at Cargés, in South America at Rio de Janeiro, and in China. And one of the things we do, one of the things we're doing right now, is actively seeking new private and government support, not just in North America, but across the world. This is our website if you want to learn more about us. This is one of the upcoming events in September. Here's another list of some of our upcoming workshops in the next 5 or 6 months. And since 1998, we've run more than 200 workshops in schools. Our Science Steering Committee meets over the internet quarterly and discusses the current proposals for new meetings, new schools. We emphasize the need for novel workshops. We don't support workshops that are repeat phenomena. We always ask the question, would this event occur with or without us? And the emphasis is on innovative, groundbreaking, and synergetic workshops that would not occur without ICAM. And workshops are encouraged to hold an outreach event, and diverse junior scientist support is a major component. We've always supported young people. We've had scientist exchange programs for more than 10 years, and over this time, some major pieces of research accomplishment have occurred. Here is an example of something from about 10 years ago. This work was ICAM sponsored and enabled Kei Fujita to be one of the lead junior authors on the discovery of nematicity in underdog breaks. We've supported many wonderful scientists who have over the years grown into junior faculty members. Here's a nice example of Mike Morrell. He was an ICAM fellow between the University of Chicago and yes, to Curie. He's just become a professor at Yale University. Here's another example from right here, Kent Maxim Zero. He was an exchange fellow between Iowa State and Rutgers University. He's just become a tenured professor here at Kent University. And last but not least, yesterday we heard from Carsten Enderlein. He was an exchange student between the CBPF in Rio de Janeiro and Cambridge, UK. And he's been instrumental in helping the exchange of new ideas about high-pressure physics between Cambridge and Brazil. And he is now a professor-elect at the University Federal Rio de Janeiro. Congratulations, Carsten. And just the last bit on outreach. ICAM is very much involved in outreach. We've done online outreach over the years. We've sponsored music. This is Google, look at one website, Music of the Quantum Wave. We hear experts in emergence talk about what it is. We've been involved in setting up an online emergent display called the Emergent Universe. You can have a look at this, and it's fun to play with. We also sponsor our various members to go out and do research. One here is Sebastian talking about emergence of Google X down the road, and you can see the levitating train that she's demonstrating at Google X with the ICAM logo on it, because ICAM paid for this levitating train. She has talked about emergence across the world from Google in California to Davos in Switzerland. We've sponsored travel awards across the world. These are just some of them. And we're very happy that this year's a result of our efforts going out to seek philanthropic support at a time when the US is going through an existential crisis and government funding is hard to come by. It does nevertheless have philanthropic donors, and the Gordon Moore Foundation has given us $600,000 for the next 3 years to help young people in scientific exchange across the globe. This is in collaboration with the Gordon Moore EPICS program, Emergent Physics in Quantum Systems. And for the next 3 years, we're going to have 20 to 30 awards per year at both the junior and senior level. They'll typically be, they can be up to 6 months, but typically be 3 to 6 week exchanges. And they can be within the ICAM network or with the EPICS network, and they can be within the ICAM network worldwide, unrestricted. So I think that's it for my presentation. This is one of our annual meetings. We've had them over the last few years in as diverse places as Hangzhou, China, New York, last year Argonne, and I want to welcome you all to our 2016 Kent meeting. I think it's going to be an amazing meeting. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you for coming. And of course, if you have any questions, I'm happy to entertain them. We, as you will see today, each of our talks is run under the Frauenfelder rules, and Daniel will tell you what those are.
Right. So the idea of the Frauenfelder rules that are kind of core to ICAM meetings is that we want to make sure that we allow almost as much time for discussion as we do for the presentation itself. So what I will do for the speakers this morning is give a signal when you're halfway through, and then hopefully you can wrap it up somewhat quickly after that, so that we'll have plenty of time for discussion. And usually we allow 33 to 50% of the time for discussion in ICAM meeting. I wanted to mention, I was trying to look up the precise numbers when Piers was speaking, but we've also had of the order of 250 publications from ICAM over the years, with I think now around 8,000 to 9,000 citations from those publications. So we've done quite well there. And I also wanted to mention that we have, while Cecile is setting up here, we have around 1,200 videos from ICAM meetings. We are videotaping these, and if you sign the release form, we'll put these up to archive on the ICAM website. At the moment, those are transitioning. We had archived those at a company called SciB.tv, but we're transitioning those to YouTube at the moment, so not all 1,200 are up, but you'll be able to find some of them on YouTube now. And those have actually got hundreds of thousands of views. So that's another service that ICAM has provided to the broad community. It's a great pleasure. I'll wait while Cecile's sitting up here. It's a great pleasure to have Cecile Sykes here. Cecile represents the Paris consortium of ICAM from the Institute Curie. And in fact, the image that Piers showed of Mike Morrell, one of our many successful fellows. By the way, I wanted to mention another one of our fellows. I'm going to forget his name. Alad Burrell. Alad actually won the PCOS, the Presidential Early Career Award, just this year, and he was a fellow a few years back from ICAM, between Israel and the University of Chicago. But Mike Morrell, who was shown up there, worked with Cecile and worked with Margaret Gardell at the University of Chicago. And so here we are going to hear some more, perhaps, about some of the related research on mimicking cell movement or shape changes of cell-sized liposomes, revealing actomyosin forces. It's a great pleasure to have Cecile Sykes here.
Thank you. Does it work? Yeah.
Yeah.
I need to move. Right, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. In fact, I did my PhD in solid-state physics, in semiconductor physics, so it's a pleasure to come back to my first love. But I became a soft matter physicist and then a biophysicist, aging. Right, so Mimicking Cell Movement is my short title. The one you had on the program is the other one. But so what we want to do in my group and in my institute is mimic cell movement, because I work in a cancer research institute, and in fact cell movement is a problem for metastasis, because cells move very quickly, metastatic cells move very quickly. As you can see here, so this is, in fact, cells can move for good things, for wound healing, for example. Here you have an example of a wound that is reconstituted on a cover slip. So you see cells, there has been a scratch here on the cover slip, and cells are trying to cover this empty space, so they move towards the scratch. And you see in 3 hours they don't do much, so you need a few days to heal your wounds, or even more. But if you look at the metastatic cell here, this is a melanoma cell. You can see that it goes through the screen in 20 minutes. So it moves within our body very quickly. And we want to stop this, and we want to understand how to stop this. How is this mechanism of cell motility or cell movement? So you have two other examples here. One is a chick fibroblast. It's a cell underneath the skin of a chick, and it doesn't move very quickly, but it still can reform the skin. And here you have the Ferrari in laboratories, which is the keratocyte. So this is, I call it a Ferrari because in 4 minutes it goes through the screen. So this is a cell that covers the scales of fish. And so you just need to take a scale of fish and put it in a petri dish with some water, some good water containing the good things, and then it will move like this on a cover slip. So in all cases, you see that cells are, in fact, a sort of bag that is filling with active matter. So active matter is a very hot topic for physicists these days. But you can imagine that underneath this membrane, you have lots of things happening. So you have biopolymers that polymerize here, and you have other biopolymers, the same biopolymers that are able to contract the rear of the cell here. So this is what we want to understand. So first of all, how is cell motility schematized? You can see it here. It's a three-step mechanism. So the first step is that, so this is a cell, again a membrane that is filled in, this is a real cell, that is filled in with biopolymers. So we'll concentrate on actin polymers here, that are in green, and again the membrane engulfs everything here. So how does it work that the cell can move here on the substrate? You have first what's called a lamellipodium. It's a thin structure surrounded by membrane, but underneath this membrane here, you have constant actin polymerization. You have constant biopolymer elongation. And this will create an extension of the structure here. So here the actin is in red because this is new actin, this is old actin. And you can see that this will propel and this will push the membrane forward just by constantly polymerizing actin here. So actin, first step is actin polymerization pushes the membrane forward. Okay, well, that's really pushes the membrane forward. And so the second step is that the membrane will adhere on the substrate, but I won't talk about this because in fact it's not needed for movement. We can come back to that in the questions. And then the third step here is the retraction by actomyosin contraction. So these motors, these red motors here, are dimers or are symmetric structures that are able to pull on the filaments, so they are able to contract these filaments. and these actin filaments. And this is by retraction of the rear of the cell that the whole cell will be able to move. So what we'll be interested in here in this talk is this step of actin polymerization and this step of retraction of the what's called, in fact, the cortex. So the cortex, the cell cortex, is the actin structure, very thin actin structure that is just underneath the membrane. So how do these networks look like? So here you have an electron microscopy image of the lamellipodium here. So you see it's a branched, entangled polymer network that looks quite complex here. And underneath the membrane here, you have the same sort of network that is branched and entangled, but it's much thinner than the one here. And if you look at the scale here, this is, so the mesh size of this network is about 50 nanometers. Right, so we'll concentrate first on this. And one interesting observation in cells is that, in fact, the same mechanism that pushes the membrane forward is able to push endosomes forward inside the cell. So this is a picture taken by electron microscopy inside a cell. So this is an endosome, which means a part of membrane that leaves the surface of the cell and gets inside the cell. And you see that it can be propelled by the same network of actin polymerization, the same actin network that polymerizes at the surface of the object here. So the question I attacked a few, more than a decade ago, was, can we reproduce this in a simple manner? Can we reproduce this mechanism with actin, with ATP, which is the source of energy of the cell, adenosine triphosphate? This is the chemical energy of the cell. This is what will make this polymer grow. So can we reproduce it? So nature did that a little bit for us with this bacterium Listeria that is able to move inside cells by the same actin polymerization mechanism as you can see here. So this is a cell. You can see that the cell is moving towards the right. So you understand that underneath this membrane you have actin polymers that push the membrane forward, but inside this cell you have also bacteria that move by the same mechanism. So here you see bacterium, you see it has what we call a comet, because so it's pushing the bacterium forward by constantly polymerizing actin at the rear. So I insist here that there is no motor here involved. It's only the production of a polymer at the surface that makes the movement. So in fact, this is what gives this function of bacterium to invade other cells, because this force created by actin polymerization is sufficient to deform the membrane and invade other cells. But the network is exactly the same here at the rear of this bacteria. So we said, can we mimic this? So this is a bit of history. So Listeria movement was first mimicked in cell extract, so just the inside of cells that was extracted from cells. Listeria movement was reconstituted in purified protein, and then we reconstitute bead movement in purified protein. So this is what you will see here, just 3 examples. This is a phase contrast movie where you see a polystyrene bead here of 2 micrometer diameter that's able to move, just like the Listeria you saw before. So you see the actin network here that appears denser. And you see that it's constantly polymerizing here and depolymerizing here. I mean, you see that the comet disappears at the rear because it's constantly regenerated in the cell. So we could change parameters of this object, like the size, the number of activators we put on the surface, and we could reproduce what was seen as a phenotype of a mutant of Listeria, which is called saltatory movement, as you see here. So now actin is fluorescent, and you see that this bead jumps under the action of actin polymerization. So I can come into the details on how it works, but it's based on friction and propulsion. And lastly, I'll show you another example of a propulsion. This time it's an oil droplet that's propelled, well, that's covered with an actin polymerization activator, and you see that it's deformed at its rear. It's just squeezed at the rear because in fact this network has elastic properties. It's constantly squeezing this object and to push it forward, and this is the basis of the movement. Right, so what do we use this for? The application is, in fact, to find drugs that act on actin polymerization, that could act on metastasis. And the principle is that we have a plaque with lots of wells. We put our beads in these wells. We put fluorescent actin. We take one reference here where we only put our system. And then in any other well, we put a drug that we want to test for actin polymerization. So if the fluorescence intensity of actin decreases, it means that actin doesn't polymerize well, so it's a good drug that could be used for metastasis. So I give you an example here with a known drug. Fluorescence intensity as a function of dose. You see that when the dose increases, the intensity of fluorescence of the actin decreases. So there have been some application with this. Right, so how can we prove that this network has some elastic properties? So the principle of our experiment, again, is to have a sphere. So I guess everybody has the question, how do you produce a comet that propels a spherical, perfectly symmetrical object? So this is what I'm talking about here. So you have spheres that are covered with this activator of actin polymerization. And when you put it in the medium of, in your mixture of proteins and ATP, what happens is that monomers polymerize at the surface of this object. But when you add more monomers, since the monomers continue to polymerize at the surface of this object, you have to push the first layer away, and so on and so forth. And then at the end, the first layer is extended because it's under pressure. And then you have a stress, a tangential stress that is applied on the first layer at the outside of the network, of the spherical network. So what happens is this movie here, I really love it. I mean, when we saw that, we thought, okay, well, now we can prove that it's elastic. So look at this. So it grows from the surface, and then after some point, it breaks open at the surface of the network. Right, so this proves that you have stresses inside this. So I show it again because I really love it. And then the next step is that you have a comet that will propel this bead towards this direction. And the velocity we find is on the same order of Listeria velocity. Right, so of course it depends on protein concentrations. I won't have time to go into the details, but we can change protein nature and protein concentrations and understand how molecularly this movement works. So why, is that relevant for cells? So this will be a transition to the other study I would like to talk about. So just to summarize, here we had no molecular motors, just actin polymerization forces. And so again, they're able to produce a stress that will lead to symmetry breaking and comet formation. We can, in some protein conditions, we can have many breakages in the shell, and we can have many comets, so the movement is very different. But we can change, again, the nature and composition of this network to get one comet or multiple comets. But now let's go into cells. So these are experiments with cell fragments. So this is the third step of actin motility, cell motility, cell movement. Now we have the motors. We'll add the role of the motors. But in fact, the structure of the cell cortex is very similar to this one. It's a spherical shell, this time inside a membrane, and you generate tension not by the spherical geometry, but by molecular motors that will pull on the filaments and contract the whole thing. So what I will show you is that the same thing happens. We can have breakages of this cortex, and that this time, because it's inside a membrane, it will blow a bulge of naked membrane, and you will see what happens. So this is this movie here. So the motors are fluorescent. You can't see the membrane here because there's no motors attached to it, but after a while you can see that actin polymerizes, then molecular motors can bind to it, and then the tension can build up, etc. And this thing can go on for hours. In fact, it creates oscillations that we didn't completely understand, but it creates oscillation because the cortex will reform, tension will build up, it will blow a new bulge that will again reform, and etc., etc. Same thing, changing the composition of the proteins will lead to many bulges instead of one. Right, so now can we mimic this? This was, so I didn't tell you, but this was in cells, in fragments of cells. In fact, cells from which we remove the nucleus because it's rigid and it's sort of less simple than a fragment. Right, so let's see how we can reproduce this. So what I just show you is how this can break in fragments of cells. So we need to have a membrane, we need to have a cortex, an actin network inside the membrane, and at the end we need to add the motors. So what we need to do is, again, have a membrane. Here in green you have the actin network, and we need to add myosin 2. So to begin with, I will show you experiments without myosin 2. Just the first step is to understand what is the actin doing to the system. So the thickness of this shell here in cells is on the order of 100 nanometers. So you see that it's not very much higher than the mesh size, which is 50 nanometers. So it's a thin shell of actin. Now, to the tension in the cortex, I showed you the effect of. You need to add the tension in the membrane because it's a bilayer that can be under tension. So the tension of the whole cell contains a contribution of both membrane tension and cortical tension. And this is what created what we call blebbing, which is what I showed you, that we can, under the tension of this cortex, it's possible to blow a bulge of membrane that can then reconstitute its cortex. So now we need to look at the mechanics of this. The mechanics of the membrane itself has been extensively studied with purified lipids and simplified liposomes. So the bending modulus is on the order of 10 kBt. This will be important for the next slides because, in fact, at room temperature, it means that the liposome constantly fluctuates, right? So it's a sort of anthropic fluctuation that will give some elasticity to the system. So now if we look at the expansion modulus, so the modulus, if I apply a force on a line on the membrane, what's the constant, what's the modulus, constant to multiply the displacement so that I get the force. So it's on the order of 0.1 Newton per meter. And there is a mechanical equation here that gives the relationship between this bending modulus and the expansion modulus, but also the thickness of the flap here. So, of course, the thicker it is, the more difficult it is to bend, right? So if we look at actin cortex mechanics now, we find that, in fact, the expansion modulus is much, much smaller than the expansion modulus of the membrane, which means that if you pull on the membrane, if you pull on a cell wall, you will pull mainly on the membrane and not on the actin cortex. But now if you are trying to bend the whole thing, the bending modulus is much higher than in the membrane. So if you bend the border of a cell, you will bend the actin network and not the membrane. You will sense the actin network and not the membrane. So now can we reconstitute it to understand it better? So we need to reconstitute the membrane. We need to reconstitute actin polymerization activation. Here it's crucial to mimic a cell, otherwise it's just an object that doesn't mimic a cell. So we need to have activation of actin polymerization here, and at the end we need to add myosin motor contraction, but I will come to that only later. So just for the aficionados of molecular mechanisms, I just put this slide. How does this actin network grow from a surface? So it's activated by the interaction between an activator, a complex, and an already existing filament. So every time you make a new polymer, in fact you make a branch. So it's a branching network. So what happens is that a filament will touch the activator, and this activator will generate a new branch. So the selection has been, evolution has been working here. And in fact, there is a capping protein that prevents this branch from growing. So in fact, at the surface of the object or the membrane, you have constant branching, but not constant growth of these branches. So in fact, after a while, you have what I call a dead zone here, where you have branches that can't grow anymore, but branches that will touch the surface will be able to create a new branch, right? So you have an active zone here where branching occurs, and a dead zone here where branches are stopped. Right, so how do we encapsulate our material? We use what we call an inverted emulsion technique. The principle is that we put the inside solution in oil-containing lipids. So we have a first layer of lipids here, and we sediment this through a second layer of lipid, like this. And then at the end, we have our material here inside and just water outside, water with salt. So how do we trigger actin polymerization? We have two ways of doing this. One is to put pores. So we put ATP and salt, so the source of energy and salt outside the liposome. And then we put pores so that we trigger actin polymerization once the pores are here. And when we trigger actin polymerization, we can see the network growing from the surface of the membrane. So we have a second way of triggering actin polymerization, which is only temperature, because with this system, with pores, we can't do much mechanics. So this is an example. So if you don't have pores, or if you are at low temperature, you have the actin that is all over the inside of the liposome. But if you add pores or increase temperature, you see that a shell of actin is produced at the inside surface of the membrane. So we use this to reproduce endocytosis of a toxin inside cells, but I don't have time to talk about this. So just a brief example of images of this liposome. So if we have large liposomes, we have thicker shells. If we have small liposomes, we have smaller shells. And so if you look at the time evolution of these patches, you see here, this is time, vertical is time. So you see that they move, whereas in large liposomes, they are stable, which means that in fact the thickness and the cohesion of the network is higher in large liposomes than in small liposomes. And the reason is geometric. So the thickness of the shell that we can do inside liposome is just proportional to the radius of these liposomes. So the biggest liposome, the thicker the cortex we get. Now, how does membrane mechanics change? How do membrane mechanics change in the presence of a cortex? So this is an experiment where this is a cortex, a liposome containing the cortex, and this is a liposome where we didn't put the activators, right? So actin is all over the inside of the liposome. So we call these liposomes cortex liposomes and these liposomes bulk liposomes. And what we want to do is compare the mechanics of the membranes in both systems. So we mix them in the same sample, in the same experiment. So we have them in green and them in red, let's say. So we can distinguish them. And we look at how their membranes are deformed as a function of time. So the experiment is a sort of very simple microfluidic experiment where we have a microstick where we attach the liposome. So there is a tube of membrane that's done by attaching on the membrane on the microstick, and we flow the liquid here. So when we flow the liquid, we can form this tube, and so if it pushes the liposome, and so we can study how it reacts under this flow of liquid. So what we were able to show is that if you compare bulk in blue and cortex liposome in red, this is the length of the tube as a function of time. You see that they react very differently. So here we just increase the velocity of the flow, right? So we increase the force at which the tube is pulled. And we see that the bulk liposomes are length of the tube in bulk liposomes is much easier than in cortex liposomes. So I didn't say yet that these systems are viscoelastic. So I told about the elasticity of the actin network, but this is at short times. If I would wait too long, this would flow. The entanglements would disentangle and all that. So for the elasticity, we need to look at short times, but as soon as we go to long times, we have a flow as a liquid. So this is a Kelvin model to try to understand what happens. And let's concentrate on the spring constant here of these experiments. So the spring constant is what we find here in the short times, and we fit this curve with the curve that would have a plateau here. So if we look at the elastic coefficient of bulk liposomes compared to cortex liposome, the elastic coefficient is much smaller. So how do we understand that? It was quite a surprise. But if we take the Elfrich theory of this spring constant I was talking about this is an entropic spring constant because the liposome is constantly fluctuating, right? So this spring constant is inversely proportional to the square of the radius of the liposome, which is not the case here. So, which means that in these liposomes with the cortex, we don't pull on a full liposome, we only pull on a part of the liposome, and it decreases in the presence of the cortex. So this means that we have chiral domains, so the presence of the actin network will prevent the mobility of the lipids inside the membrane. And as a conclusion, in fact, in a pure membrane, we would have a tube that is pulled with this flow I just showed you, with some elasticity here. But if we have an actin cortex underneath the membrane, it will create domains and immobilize the lipids in the membrane, and then we won't pull on the whole surface of the liposome, but only on a small surface of it. Right, now, very quickly, what about cell tension? This was cell mechanics, so the take-home message here is that, in fact, the presence of the network is changing the properties of the membrane, right? But it's also changing the property, of course, of the whole thing. So very quickly, we measured cell tension with using a soft matter, very easy soft matter experiment. So we stick two liposomes together, and we look at the shape of these doublets. If the tension increases, this shape will become more round, right? And if we can see a change in this tension, so we can measure it and measure the increase in tension. So this time, we did that with the actin cortex outside. So I won't go into the details, but we can either have a passive actin cortex and then we want to add the myosin, or we have an active actin cortex where we add the myosin. Right, and what we see is here, we clearly see a tension increase. So we have, this is actin, a fluorescent actin. We have no markage of actin inside, in the adhesion where the two liposomes adhere, because we put the actin after the doublets are formed. And we look at the change of shape of the whole doublet. And we can get, so just by writing the balance of forces here at the contact angle. So for obvious reason in France, it's called the Laplace law, but it's Young's law. So if we look at the balance of forces here, we will have two equations. We project it on this axis or on the orthogonal axis. And since we take only symmetrical doublets, so this one is just at the limit, but we take only symmetrical doublets, we can make the hypothesis that the two angles are the same, and that the adhesion here is constant. And then we get the increase of tension. So the increase of tension is just the ratio of the cosines, initial and final cosines. And what we find at the end is that, in fact, the angle increases, and the increase in tension is only by a factor of 2. So that was a surprise because these cells, I mean, the cells are known to be able to round up when just before they divide, and we were expecting that the increase in tension would be much higher. But in fact, if we look at the work in cells, so in cells you do the opposite, you don't add the ingredients one by one, you remove them, right? And if they look at cells, so normal cells, and if they remove the myosins, they see that the tension decreases by a factor of 2. So it's not completely out of the scope to find an increase by a factor of 2, whereas in cells, it's found that there is a decrease by a factor of 2. So it sort of quantifies the increase in tension by the action of modules. Okay, I will skip this. Before I conclude, I just want to show you new experiments, very new experiments here. So what we did was exactly the same thing. We put actin at the membrane that is able to assemble dynamically. So it's just actin, no motors here. If we